He walked into that village wearing no medals, no insignia, nothing that marked him as the man an entire nation had once celebrated as a hero. He wanted for once to be looked at and not saluted. What he didn't expect was a widow standing by a well, telling a complete stranger exactly what she thought of generals who let soldiers die quietly and call it duty. She had no idea who she was talking to, and by the time she found out, it would already be too late to take any of it back. The carriage stopped at the edge of the village, far enough from the church and the market square that no one would notice the crest painted faintly beneath the dust on its door. General Edmund Calloway stepped down wearing a plain brown coat, the kind any merchant or traveling clerk might wear, and for the first time in 11 years, no one straightened their back when he passed. He had chosen this village because it was small, forgotten, the sort of place that newspapers never reached, and gossip moved slower than the river beside it. He had not come for rest, though rest was what his physician had ordered after the fevers of the past winter. He had come because a name had reached him through a letter from a dying soldier, a name belonging to a woman who had once written to the War Office asking questions no one had answered. Calloway had read that letter more times than he could admit, and something in its plain, furious honesty had pulled him here without a uniform, without a title, without the armor he had worn since the age of 19. The inn was small, with low beams and a fire that smoked more than it warmed. But the woman behind the counter did not look at him twice, did not seem to care whether his coat was fine or worn thin at the elbows. That, more than anything, told him he had found the right place to disappear. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who think they know exactly who you are, stay with this one. Subscribe now, because what happens next in this village is going to surprise you. Word of a stranger spread quickly through any village, but this one had learned, through years of war and loss, that questions were often more dangerous than silence. Calloway settled into a small rented room above the bakery, paid in coin that raised no eyebrows, and spent his first days walking unfamiliar streets, like a man relearning how to exist without rank attached to his name. He watched the blacksmith's apprentice argue with a farmer over the price of nails, watched children chase a dog through the square, watched an old woman feed pigeons from a chipped clay bowl, and none of them turned to salute him or lower their eyes. For a man who had spent over a decade being seen first as a title and only second as a person, the anonymity felt almost unbearable in its gentleness. It was on his third evening, as dusk folded itself over the rooftops, that he heard a voice near the well speaking about soldiers in a way he had never heard a civilian speak before, not with pity, not with empty admiration, but with something harder and far more honest. Her name was Margaret Lowell, though Calloway would not learn it until later that night. She stood near the well with 2 other village women, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her voice carrying clearly across the cooling air as she spoke about the soldiers who had returned from the war, broken in ways no metal could mend. She said that men came home with their bodies intact, and their minds left somewhere on a battlefield no one back home would ever see, and that the country expected them to simply resume their lives as though nothing inside them had been rearranged. Calloway stopped walking. He had heard generals speak of sacrifice in grand halls, had heard poets write of glory and duty, but he had never heard anyone speak of the actual weight soldiers carried home with such unflinching clarity. Margaret said that the worst injuries were the ones that left no scar visible to a doctor, and that society preferred wounded men silent because their silence was easier to live beside than their grief. He approached without announcing himself, asking only what business it was of hers to speak so plainly about matters most women were taught to leave untouched. Margaret turned to him, unbothered by his tone, and said that she had buried a husband who came home from the war already half a ghost. and that she had earned the right to speak of soldiers however she pleased. Margaret's words struck something in Calloway that 11 years of command had never managed to loosen. She told him, a stranger she assumed to be nothing more than a traveling merchant, that the generals who sent men to die rarely stayed long enough to watch what living looked like afterward, that they collected their honors and rode away while widows learned to feed children alone. She did not know who stood before her, and that ignorance gave her words a brutal, unguarded weight he had never received from anyone who knew his name. He asked her, carefully, what she thought a man owed the soldiers he commanded once the war had ended. Margaret considered the question longer than he expected, before answering that a man owed them the truth, always, even when the truth was unbearable, because soldiers had already given everything else they had to give. She said most officers offered comfort instead of honesty, and comfort without honesty was simply another kind of abandonment. Calloway said nothing for a long moment, the cold settling around them as the well's stone edge bit faintly into his palm. He had spent over a decade believing his silence was a form of mercy toward the men under his command, a way of sparing them his own doubt. And Margaret Lowell had just dismantled that belief without knowing she held the blade. He learned her full name only when the innkeeper mentioned it in passing the following morning, attaching to it the quiet detail that her husband, Private Thomas Lowell, had died 3 winters past under the command of a general whose name the innkeeper could not quite recall. Calloway's hands stilled over his cup of tea, the warmth suddenly meaningless against the cold settling through his chest, because he remembered Thomas Lowell. He remembered the letter informing the family, written in his own hand, the careful phrasing he had chosen to soften a death that had not been soft at all. He had written dozens of such letters over the years, each one a small attempt to give grief a gentler shape than the truth deserved. And he had never once considered that the widow receiving his careful words might one day stand before him and speak of soldiers with the exact fury his letters had tried to prevent. The realization settled into him slowly, like cold water finding every gap in a coat that had once felt sufficient. But Calloway said nothing of what he now knew. Not yet. Because some instinct deeper than honor told him that revealing his name too soon would close a door Margaret Lowell had only just, unknowingly, opened. And that night, lying awake above the bakery, he understood that he had not come to this village merely to rest. He had come because some part of him needed to hear, from someone who owed him nothing, exactly what he had cost. He knew her husband's name. He knew exactly how he died, and he was the one who wrote the letter that told her so. But Margaret had no idea the stranger drinking tea beside her was the very man she had cursed at the well. What happens when she finds out wouldn't stay quiet for long. Calloway woke before dawn, the weight of what he had learned pressing against his ribs like a stone he could not set down. He told himself, as he dressed in the gray morning light, that the honorable course was to seek Margaret out and confess everything immediately, to stand before her and admit that the man she had cursed at the well was the very man drinking tea beside her doorstep. But honor, he had learned over years of command, did not always point toward the kindest road. And some part of him understood that his confession would end something before it had even properly begun. He decided, against every instinct his rank had trained into him, to remain a stranger a little longer, not out of cowardice, he told himself, but because for the first time since the war had ended, someone was speaking to him as a man rather than a title, and he was not yet ready to surrender that fragile, undeserved gift. It was a decision built on sand, and he knew it even as he made it. By mid-morning, he found reasons to walk past the well again, past the bakery, past the small cottage at the edge of the lane where he had learned Margaret lived alone since her husband's death. He told himself he was merely observing the village, learning its rhythms. But the truth was simpler and far less comfortable. He wanted to hear her voice again before the weight of his name destroyed whatever this strange, borrowed peace had become. In the small trunk he had brought from the city, folded beneath shirts and a razor he rarely used, lay his uniform, pressed, decorated, untouched, since the day his physician had ordered him south for his health. He had packed it out of habit rather than intention, the way a man might pack a weapon he hoped never to need. And each night he opened the trunk only far enough to look at it, before closing the lid again. The nightmares had not stopped simply because the war had ended. They arrived most often near dawn, dragging him back to fields he had tried for years to leave behind, to the faces of men whose names he still recited silently before sleep claimed him each night. A small private ritual no one had ever witnessed. He had told no physician the full truth of these visits, had told no fellow officer the shape of his grief, because a general who admitted to nightmares was a general other men quietly stopped trusting. Margaret's words from the well returned to him each time he closed that trunk. That society preferred wounded men silent because their silence was easier to live beside than their grief. He wondered, lying awake in a narrow bed above a bakery that smelled faintly of yeast and wood smoke, whether he had spent 11 years performing exactly the silence she despised, mistaking it all along for strength. It was Margaret who led him, 2 days later, to a small cottage at the village's far edge, where a man named Colonel Whitfield lived in near isolation, his right leg lost to a cannon's careless aim years before. Calloway recognized the name instantly and felt his chest tighten, because Whitfield had served directly beneath him, had followed orders that cost him that leg and very nearly his life. He had assumed, as commanders sometimes allowed themselves to assume, that Whitfield had been properly cared for by the Army's pension and forgotten the rest. He had not. Margaret visited the colonel 3 times each week, bringing bread, changing dressings the local doctor had grown too busy to attend to, sitting with him through the silences that stretched longer than conversation on his worst days. She did this without payment, without recognition, without anyone in the village remarking on it as anything unusual, because to her it was simply what one did for a man the war had broken and the country had quietly abandoned. Calloway stood in the doorway of that small cottage, watching Margaret speak to Whitfield with the same unflinching honesty she had offered a stranger at the well, and understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that this woman had been doing privately, for years, the work that generals and ministers only ever discussed in speeches. He returned to that cottage often after that first visit, telling Whitfield only that he was a traveling merchant interested in the colonel's stories of the war. And Whitfield, lonely enough to welcome any company, never questioned the lie. But Calloway watched Margaret more closely each time, noting how she never once offered Whitfield pity, never softened her voice into the careful condescension so many used toward wounded men, never treated his missing leg as the most important thing about him. She argued with Whitfield about politics, teased him about his stubborn refusal to eat vegetables, asked his opinion on village matters as though his judgment had not diminished alongside his leg. It was respect built from honesty rather than performance. The exact opposite of the careful, distant courtesies Calloway had spent his career extending toward wounded soldiers from behind a desk. He found himself, on the walk back to the bakery each evening, comparing every gesture he had ever made toward his men against the plain decency Margaret offered, without thought or audience. The comparison left him quieter each time, and he began to suspect that the letters he had written, the medals he had pinned, the speeches he had given, had all been a different language entirely from the one that actually reached a broken man's heart. It was inevitable that a village this small would begin to notice the stranger who lingered too long, who asked too many careful questions, who carried himself with a stillness no merchant or clerk ever quite managed. By the second week, Whispers moved through the market stalls. Someone had seen fine stitching beneath his plain coat's collar. Someone else had noticed the way he stood when he thought no one watched. Shoulders set like a man accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. Margaret heard the whispers too, though she said nothing of them when Calloway visited Whitfield's cottage that week. She watched him instead, with a new, careful attention. The kind a woman gives a puzzle she has only just realized does not match the picture on its box. He noticed her watching and felt, for the first time since arriving, the cold edge of exposure creeping toward him. But the whisper that would truly unravel everything was still 2 days from reaching the village, carried not by a market gossip, but by a carriage bearing a crest far more polished than the one hidden beneath dust on his own. Lady Constance Prior had grown tired of waiting in the city for a general who had vanished without explanation, and she was not a woman accustomed to being kept waiting. A carriage was already on its way, carrying a woman who had no patience left, and a name that would unravel everything in a single sentence. Calloway didn't know it yet, but his quiet life in this village had less than 2 days left to survive. The carriage arrived on a gray afternoon, its wheels cutting through mud the village had not bothered to clear, and its very presence seemed to silence the market square the moment it rolled into view. Lady Constance Prior stepped down without waiting for the driver's hand. Her traveling cloak the color of deep wine, every line of her posture announcing a woman who belonged somewhere far grander than this forgotten cluster of cottages and crooked fences. She had spent 3 days tracing rumors of a general who had abandoned the city without warning, and she had no intention of pretending the search had been anything less than an insult to her patience. She found him near the bakery, dressed still in his plain brown coat, his hands faintly dusted with flour from helping the baker's wife lift a tray. And for one suspended moment, Calloway watched recognition cross her face like weather changing over open water. Lady Constance did not lower her voice as she addressed him, did not consider for even a heartbeat that a quiet village street demanded any softer tone than a city drawing room. She called him General Calloway clearly, deliberately, the title ringing out across the square loud enough that the blacksmith paused mid-strike, and 2 children stopped chasing their dog to stare. Margaret stood not 10 paces away, a basket of bread balanced against her hip, and Calloway watched the precise moment her expression shifted from simple curiosity into something far colder, far more wounded. She had spoken to this man at the well as though he were no one of consequence, had cursed generals in his presence without knowing she addressed one directly, had shared Whitfield's quiet dignity with a stranger who had, in truth, been the very commander who sent the colonel to lose his leg. The bread in her basket suddenly seemed to weigh far more than its ordinary measure, and she turned without a single word and walked toward her cottage, her back straight in a way that told him exactly how deeply the deception had cut. Margaret just learned the truth in front of the whole village. If you think you know how she's going to respond, you might want to think again. Hit subscribe before the next part. This is where everything changes. Calloway followed her as far as her gate before stopping, some instinct warning him that pursuing her further would only deepen whatever wound his silence had already caused. He stood there in the thin afternoon light, watching her cottage door close with a quiet finality that felt far louder than any slammed wood ever could, and understood that explanations offered too quickly often sounded like excuses rather than honesty. Lady Constance's carriage remained parked near the inn behind him, a constant reminder that his old life had finally caught up to the borrowed peace he had been living inside. He returned to his room above the bakery that evening without eating, the trunk containing his uniform sitting open at the foot of his narrow bed for the first time since his arrival. He stared at the polished buttons, the careful stitching, the small bar of medals that meant nothing to the men who had actually bled beneath his command. and felt something close to disgust at how easily that uniform had once made him believe his silence was strength rather than cowardice dressed in finer cloth. Margaret had not cursed his rank that night at the well. She had cursed exactly this: the distance, the performance, the careful absence of truth that left widows and wounded men to carry grief alone while officers collected honors for surviving it. The following morning, he walked to her gate and knocked, and though no one answered, he could hear movement inside, the deliberate quiet of a woman choosing not to open a door rather than failing to hear it. He left a single folded note tucked beneath a stone on her step, containing no excuse and no apology dressed as explanation, only a request that she allow him one honest conversation before deciding what kind of man he truly was. Margaret read the note 3 times before she finally opened her door to him 2 evenings later, her expression guarded in a way that made the easy honesty of their first conversation feel like something borrowed from another lifetime entirely. Calloway sat across from her at a small wooden table, his hands folded tightly enough that his knuckles paled, and told her the truth he had not offered anyone in over a decade. He confessed that he had hidden his name not to deceive her cruelly, but because for one fragile stretch of days, strangers had spoken to him as a man rather than a rank, and he had been starving for that simple, undecorated recognition longer than he had admitted even to himself. He told her of the letters he wrote to families like hers, each one carefully worded to soften deaths that deserved no softening, and how her unguarded fury at the well had been the first honest response his careful phrasing had ever truly earned. He admitted that generals were trained to offer comfort in place of truth, exactly as she had once accused, and that he had spent years mistaking that performance for mercy until she named it, without knowing his name. For the abandonment it actually was. His voice did not waver as he spoke, though something in his posture suggested a man setting down armor he had worn so long he had forgotten its weight. Margaret listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold, and when he finished, she asked him only one question: whether he had ever told Whitfield or any soldier under his command the things he had just told her. Calloway's silence answered before his voice could, and Margaret nodded slowly, not in forgiveness, but in the quiet recognition of a wound far older and far deeper than the small lie of a borrowed name. It was Margaret's turn then to speak of things she had carried alone since her husband's death, and the rawness of her words filled the small cottage like cold air through an opened window. She told him that Thomas had returned from the war 3 years prior, his body whole but his eyes already belonging to some distant battlefield no physician could name or treat, and that she had watched him disappear slowly over 18 months, while neighbors whispered that she should simply be grateful he had come home at all. No officer had visited, no letter beyond the formal notice of his eventual death had ever acknowledged that a soldier's suffering could outlast the war that caused it. She said that society had handed her 2 choices in her grief: silence or scandal, because a widow who spoke too plainly about a husband's unraveling mind was considered indecent, while a widow who said nothing at all was simply praised for her composure. Margaret had chosen, against every expectation placed upon her, to speak anyway, because she had decided that Thomas deserved at least one voice willing to name what the war had actually done to him, even if that voice belonged only to his widow and reached no one of consequence. Calloway listened to every word with a stillness that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with the unbearable accuracy of her grief against his own failures. He understood, sitting in that small cottage with cooling tea between them, that Margaret had spent 3 years doing alone the work his entire office had been built to provide and had consistently failed to deliver: acknowledgement, honesty, the simple admission that a soldier's wounds did not end where the battlefield did. Calloway visited Whitfield 2 days later, no longer hiding behind the pretense of a curious merchant, and told the colonel plainly who he had been all along. Whitfield received the confession with far less anger than Calloway had braced for, studying his former commander's face for a long moment before saying that he had suspected it for some time. Recognizing something in the general's bearing that no merchant's coat could fully disguise, what Whitfield said next settled into Calloway's chest with far more weight than any rebuke could have carried. The colonel told him that Margaret had been the only person in the village, in the entire country, if Whitfield was honest, who had ever sat with him through the worst of his despair without flinching, without offering false comfort, without treating his missing leg as a tragedy to be managed rather than a fact to be lived alongside. He said that in the darkest months after his injury, when even his own family had grown uneasy around his silences, Margaret arrived anyway, week after week, asking nothing and demanding nothing beyond his honesty. Whitfield said it plainly. She had saved more of him than any doctor or pension ever had, and she had done it without once being asked. Calloway left that cottage with Whitfield's words echoing louder than any battlefield order he had ever given, understanding now with full clarity exactly what kind of woman he had wounded with his small, fearful deception. He had spent 11 years believing that command meant carrying burdens silently so that others would not have to witness his doubt, and Margaret Lowell had just shown him, without ever intending to teach him anything, that the silence he mistook for strength had cost more than any honest confession ever could have. Whitfield was about to say something Calloway never expected to hear, something that would make him understand exactly who Margaret really was, and exactly how much his silence had cost. He thought he already knew the worst of what he'd lost. He was wrong. Lady Constance did not leave the village quietly, nor had Calloway expected her to. She remained at the inn for the better part of a week, her presence a constant reminder to the village that the stranger in the plain brown coat belonged, by rights and by birth, to a world far removed from bread baskets and well-water gossip. When she finally cornered Calloway near the church on a cold morning, her patience thoroughly spent, she did not bother lowering her voice for the benefit of passers-by. She told him plainly that his continued presence in this forgotten village was an embarrassment to his name, his rank, and the family expectations that had quietly arranged his future long before he had any say in the matter. She mentioned Margaret directly then, her tone sharpening into something far crueler than simple impatience, calling her a widow of no consequence, a woman whose closeness to a colonel and now to a general was, in her words, an inconvenience that needed correcting before it became a scandal worth repeating in the city's drawing rooms. She suggested, with the casual cruelty of someone certain of her own superiority, that Calloway return with her immediately, resume the engagement their families had long assumed, and leave this village and its widow to fade quietly from memory as though neither had ever mattered. Calloway listened to all of it without interruption, watching villagers slow their steps nearby, sensing the shape of a confrontation building in the cold morning air. He had spent his entire career deferring to exactly this kind of pressure, the quiet, relentless expectation that a man of his position owed his choices to family and title rather than to his own conscience. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt no obligation whatsoever to comply. What Calloway said next would be repeated through the village for years afterward, though never with full accuracy, because no one present could quite agree on his exact words, only on the unmistakable steel that had entered his voice. He told Lady Constance, in front of the gathering villagers, that Margaret Lowell possessed more honor in caring for one forgotten colonel than half of London's drawing rooms had shown the entire war's wounded combined. He said that titles meant nothing beside the kind of courage it took to sit with a broken man's silence week after week, asking nothing in return, and that he would not apologize for finally recognizing decency when he had been fortunate enough to witness it firsthand. He continued, his voice steady despite the flush of anger building beneath Lady Constance's composed exterior, stating that he had spent 11 years mistaking silence for strength and performance for honor, and that the woman she dismissed so easily had taught him, without ever intending to, exactly how much that mistake had cost the men under his command. He said he owed Margaret an apology far larger than any explanation he had already given her, and that he intended to spend whatever time it required earning her trust honestly, regardless of what that decision cost him socially or politically. Lady Constance's expression hardened into something between disbelief and fury, and she turned without another word, climbing back into her carriage with the rigid dignity of a woman unaccustomed to losing any argument, let alone one fought in a muddy village square before an audience of farmers and bakers. The carriage pulled away within the hour, and the village, true to its nature, said little aloud about what it had witnessed, though something in the air had shifted permanently regarding how they viewed the quiet stranger who had finally stopped hiding his name. Margaret heard of the confrontation before the day's end, the village's silence proving, as always, far less effective than its whispers. She found Calloway near Whitfield's cottage that evening, his coat still the same plain brown it had always been, though something in his bearing had changed in a way she could not immediately name. She told him she had heard what he said to Lady Constance, and that while it had moved something loosened in her chest, she would not pretend that one public defense erased the quiet sting of his earlier deception. She set her condition plainly, the same unflinching honesty that had first drawn his attention at the well now turned directly toward him. She told him that if he wished for anything resembling her trust, he would need to offer her truth always, without exception, even when truth proved inconvenient or unflattering or difficult to voice aloud. She said she had buried one man who carried his pain in silence until it consumed him entirely, and she would not spend whatever years remained to her loving another man who mistook silence for protection rather than recognizing it for the slow abandonment it truly was. Calloway agreed without hesitation, though he understood the weight of what he had just promised, far better than most men might. He told her that he could not undo 11 years of careful, practiced silence overnight, but that he intended to try, beginning with the smallest truths and building toward whatever larger honesty their future together might eventually require. Margaret studied him for a long moment beneath the fading evening light, neither fully convinced nor entirely doubtful, and told him that trying, at least, was more than most men ever offered. 3 days later, Calloway carried his trunk to Whitfield's cottage and, in front of both the Colonel and Margaret, opened it fully for the first time since his arrival. He lifted the uniform out carefully, its metals catching the late afternoon light, and told them both that he had kept it packed, not from necessity, but from habit. A reluctance to fully release the identity that had defined him since he was 19 years old. He said that wearing it again would always remain possible, should duty someday require it, but that he no longer needed its weight to remind himself who he was meant to be. He gave the medals to Whitfield, not as a gift exactly, but as an acknowledgment long overdue, telling the Colonel plainly that the honors had been earned as much by the men who served beneath him as by any decision he had made from behind a desk. Whitfield accepted them with visible difficulty, his composure cracking for the first time in Calloway's presence, and said quietly that no general had ever offered him anything beyond a pension and a polite letter until this moment. The simple gesture rearranged something between the two men that years of formal rank had never managed to settle. Margaret watched the exchange in silence, and when Calloway finally closed the empty trunk, she said only that surrendering a uniform meant little if a man's habits remained unchanged beneath the surface. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that he had taken his first real step, and Calloway understood, watching her expression soften by some small fraction, that earning the rest would require considerably more than a single gesture, however sincere. The weeks that followed asked more of Calloway than any campaign he had ever led, though the battles now were quieter and far more personal. He began visiting Whitfield without needing Margaret present to prompt him, listening to the Colonel's stories not as research for some future report, but because he had finally understood what listening without obligation actually felt like. He told Margaret things he had told no one. The names of men he still recited before sleep each night. The specific weight of decisions that still visited him in dreams. Offering her the unguarded honesty she had demanded, rather than the careful performance he had once mistaken for strength. Margaret, in turn, allowed herself slowly to trust the consistency of his presence, rather than the eloquence of any single confession. She watched him return day after day, watched him sit with Whitfield through difficult silences exactly as she had taught him, watched him answer her questions plainly even when plain answers cost him some measure of pride. Trust, she had learned through Thomas's slow, unraveling years before, was never built through grand declarations, but through the unremarkable accumulation of small, honest days. It was Whitfield who finally said aloud what both of them had been circling for weeks, telling Calloway bluntly one evening that a man did not visit a widow's cottage as often as he visited Margaret's, unless something beyond friendship had taken root. Calloway did not deny it, and that evening, walking Margaret home beneath a sky just beginning to surrender its daylight, he told her plainly that he had stopped thinking of this village as a temporary refuge and started thinking of it as the place he most wanted to remain. The following spring, the village held its modest seasonal gathering in the square, where Lady Constance's carriage had once announced Calloway's hidden name, and this time he stood there fully known, his old uniform left behind in its trunk, his bearing no longer that of a man hiding from his own history. Margaret stood beside him, her sleeves rolled as they always were, speaking with the same unflinching honesty that had first drawn his attention at the well nearly a year before, except now her words were softened by something neither of them bothered to hide any longer. Whitfield watched them from a wooden bench near the church, his recovered medals pinned discreetly to a coat he rarely wore, and remarked to a neighbor that the general who had arrived without his uniform had somehow given this village more honesty than any decorated officer ever had. The village, which had once known Calloway only as a careful stranger with two straight shoulders, now knew him as the man who had chosen to stay, who visited the wounded without obligation, who had finally learned that silence, however dignified it appeared, was never the same as strength. As the gathering's lanterns were lit against the gathering dusk, Calloway took Margaret's hand without ceremony, without grand declaration, in the same plain, unguarded manner that had defined every honest moment between them since the well. He had arrived in this village searching for rest, and had found instead the one truth no rank or medal had ever taught him: that being truly seen by someone who owed him nothing was worth more than every honor a war had ever given him. And as the village settled into evening around them, Edmund Calloway understood, finally and completely, that he had stopped being a general the moment he had started being honest, and that Margaret Lowell had been the only person brave enough to show him the difference. If this story moved you, that's exactly what it was meant to do. Let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. Was it the well, the confession, or the uniform finally laid down? And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another story waiting.